Good morning, everyone, to today's webinar. We're going to start with a few introductory remarks from the director of our division, Charles Katwanga, and then we will move on to Ricardo's presentation. Charles, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marta. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Greetings from a wintry New York, and welcome to today's webinar. It is my pleasure to introduce Ricardo Gómez Carrera of the World Inequality Lab. Ricardo is the lead author of the World Inequality Report, a report which has significantly advanced how we measure and understand income and wealth inequality around the world. We meet as inequality has become one of the defining trends of our era. A growing body of research, including our own in the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, shows how high and growing inequality reduces economic opportunity, fuels distrust, and fosters political and social instability. At the Second World Summit for Social Development that was convened in Doha last November, governments recommitted to reducing inequality and advancing social justice. They recognized that inclusive development depends on addressing gaps within and among countries. Indeed, it is increasingly clear that progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals depends on narrowing such gaps. Rigorous data and analysis, such as that produced by the World Inequality Lab, are essential to this effort. So, dear colleagues, participants, without any further delay, please do join me in welcoming Ricardo. And I now hand over to my colleague, Marta Roig, who will moderate today's session. Thank you, Marta. Thank you again, Ricardo, for joining us.
Thank you, Charles, and welcome, everyone. To your introductory remarks, Charles, I would only add that this is the third report in the World Inequality Report series. And despite this short history, it's already become a key reference, if not the key reference, in discussions on income inequality and wealth inequality around the world. And also that this edition of the report presents new data on income and wealth inequality, but also on many other topics that are relatively new in the domain, or where there's a dearth of research. And that includes climate change and inequality, political inequalities, and gender inequality. The report, I think, and Ricardo will say more about that, is a summary of a significant amount of research done by researchers in the lab and outside of the lab. So with that, I'll give the floor to Ricardo, who will speak for about 40 minutes. And then we will have about 20 minutes for questions and answers. I would encourage you all to post your questions in the Q&A chat, Q&A tab during the presentation or after, once Ricardo ends his presentation. Ricardo, the floor is yours.
Hello, Marta and Charles. Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me. I am Ricardo Gómez Carrera. I am a researcher at the World Inequality Lab, and I will present the main findings of the World Inequality Report 2026, which was published in November, and it's a third edition, as you mentioned, of this ongoing research, where we present the main findings that we have made in the past 4 years with what has developed in the past. So first of all, let me provide an overview. The World Inequality Report synthesizes the work of more than 200 researchers from around the world, from every region of the world, who are affiliated with the World Inequality Lab and the World Inequality Database. In the World Inequality Lab, we track inequality across various dimensions, such as income and wealth, but also gender, education, and carbon divides. We do this over time and across countries, as well as within countries, or also across regions and within regions. A key characteristic is that we standardize our methodology so results are comparable and transparent. The key finding of the report is that the world is extremely and persistently unequal, and a tiny global elite captures most income and wealth and accounts for most of the climate damage. This is important because inequality shapes access to opportunity, democratic outcomes, political influence, and the habitability of our planet. A main highlight of our report is that inequality remains fundamentally driven by political choices. So we can reduce it. We can reduce inequality through the policies we choose to implement through our democratic participation. As a context, we have observed that regarding income inequality, top to bottom income gaps have compressed by a factor of over 10 over a century. And this is because of higher prosperity as a consequence of redistributive policies. So these redistributive policies, I will come back to them several times during the presentation because they are very important, and they are investments in such as in education or in health, social protection, capital control, and improvement of labor rights, such as increases in minimum wages, but it's also about progressive taxation. So even if if income divides, income inequality has been reduced, wealth inequality remains extreme everywhere. Around the world, the bottom 50% typically owns less than 5% of the wealth there is to own. Meanwhile, wealth shares have been rising at the top of the distribution. We need to move towards inequality reduction between and within countries in both dimensions, inequality, income and wealth, but also in other dimensions to address the challenges of this century. So before getting into each section with more detail, let me tell you that we have a dedicated website for the World Inequality Report 2026. This is the domain, and you can also scan the QR code. You can find the full report, all the replication packages, all the images in PNG format or in Excel if you want to see if a certain figure you're interested in it and you want to change the format, you can do so with our Excels. We have translated the executive summary from English to several languages. I think we have it in 12 languages. So please explore our website and you can get familiarized with the report. Another, the website of the World Inequality database is with.world, in case you are interested in that too. Because in the report we take a more macro approach and we talk more about regions. But if you want country by country data, that you can find in the World Inequality database, so with.world. Then let me take you quickly through the structure of the report. So we have a foreword by Stiglitz and Ghosh. Then we have the executive summary, which is mainly what I will be presenting today. And then we go by chapters. No, the first chapter, in the first chapter, we explore global economic inequality, mainly across income and wealth at the global dimension. And we explore the historical trends, but also how it has changed across groups. We explain how we divide population between income or wealth groups. So the top 10%, the bottom 50% are the ones that we use the most, also the middle 40%. But we also go into the top, no? Within the top 10%, we have the top 1% or even the top 0.001%. And a unique trait of the World Inequality Database and the World Inequality Lab is that we can zoom in these top groups, not top income and wealth groups, even go to the top of the distribution. So we do that at the global level in the first chapter. In the second chapter, we explore the trends, the macro trends at the regional level regarding income inequality. And then within regions, we also explore inequality. So first across regions and then within regions. In the third chapter, we do something similar, but for wealth. And then we go to chapter 4, in which we address another key dimension of inequality that is the gender gaps. And we study the gender gap with the conventional measures, but we also do a novel contribution. We have a new methodology to measure the gender gaps, which I will explain in more detail. In chapter 5 of the report, we talk about the exorbitant privilege and how this US exorbitant privilege has evolved into a structural privilege of the rich world. which I will go into detail in a few slides. In chapter 6 of the report, we talk about climate inequality and how different approaches can, so if we focus on consumption or in wealth, how it can yield different results. Then chapter 7, which I think is very important, we talk about global taxation of multimillionaires and why progressive taxation matters. I will also stress a lot this point of progressive taxation. We also will explore, well, we explore in the chapter 7 the fact of regressivity at the top of the distribution. And I will present some tax justice proposals. Then in chapter 8, which is also a contribution of this report, is talk about the political cleavages and how policy and the political sphere relate to inequality. So I will start now with the executive summary, but I will not present the whole report, only the executive summary. And I will start by presenting income and wealth, which are like the main, how we started this project and are one of the main measures of inequality, of how we measure inequality. So let me start by defining them. So income is the money you receive regularly. It usually comes from your job, a business, government benefits. Wealth is the value of what you own minus what you owe. It includes things like your savings, your investments, and your possessions, and after you subtract debt. When we analyze the global income in the left panel, we see that the top 10% earns 53% of the global income. This is huge compared to the 8% that the bottom 50% earns. So 10% of the population earns more than 6 times what half of the population earns. We can see that income inequality is large. Even though if I mentioned earlier that income inequality had been reduced, it's also still quite large. But then wealth inequality is larger and is extreme. In the panel in the right, it shows that the top 10% owns 75% of everything that there is to own, while the bottom 50% only owns 2% of the global wealth. So let me say that again differently. Half of the population owns 2% of the global wealth, while the top 10% owns 75%. This is 37 times more. So the world is extremely unequal. Then we see that wealth inequality is not only extreme, it is also persistent and increasing. This graph shows that the share of global wealth owned by the bottom 50% increased from 1.4% in 1995 to 2% in 2025. In the meantime, the share of the wealth of the top 0.001%, so this is about less than 6,000 individuals, it has increased from 4% to 6%. So extreme inequality is persistent and is increasing. Overall, this graph shows that the top 0.001% of the global population, so a population that could fit into a football stadium, have 3 times more wealth than half of humanity combined. And their wealth is increasing at a faster pace than that of the bottom 50%. This complements the previous graph. So this graph shows again how wealth is increasing much more for the already very wealthy. It is organized so that the bottom deciles are at the left of the x-axis and the wealthiest groups are at the right of the x-axis. It shows the annual growth rate in wealth from 1995 to 2025. You can appreciate that in the last 3 decades, wealth has grown at a pace. If you see it only at the bottom 50%, wealth has grown at a pace of about 3.4% annually. So that's for the bottom 50%. And if we were only to look at the top 10%, we could think that the wealth grew for them. Well, we would see that the wealth grew for the top 10% at around 2.9% annually, which is lower than the 3.4 for the bottom 50. So we could think that there is some slight inequality reduction. But again, as I say, something that we can do in the World Inequality Lab is make a zoom in the top of the distribution. And if we zoom in, we see that inequality is not really, extreme inequality is not really reducing. The wealth of the top 0.001% has grown at 4.9% annually, which is more than the 3.4% annually for the bottom 50. And for the billionaires, so those at the right, it has grown by more than 8.5% annually. So we see that extreme inequality is rapidly increasing. And then it is important to stress that in this graph, we show growth rates, so annual growth rates. So they look in a similar range. But if we were to consider that at the baselines from which these growth rates are coming, we would see that the disparities are great. The wealth has grown much more for the already extreme wealthy. So for instance, given that the average wealth of a person in the bottom 50% is around 6,500 euros, if the trends continue in the next year, an average person in the bottom 50% would have an additional 230 euros in wealth. But then in the meanwhile, a person in the top 0.001% would have an additional 1 million euros if the trend continues. And someone in the top 50, so in the top 50 individuals, if the trend continues, would have 285 million additional euros. So we see that the inequalities are very large and rapidly increasing. And what is staggering is that this is not the first time we present this finding. This, as I mentioned, this is the third installment of the World Inequality Report, and the 2022 edition already presented these results. So it's impressive that it's still a major finding in this report, and it's still increasing at a very rapid pace. Then with this graph, what I want to show is that it's not an anomaly. It's not something that it's just in one region of the world. So this graph presents the different regions that we use for the report: Europe, East Asia, North America, and Oceania, South and Southeast Asia, Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, Middle East and North Africa, and Russia and Central Asia. And we see that the richest 1% own more wealth than the poorest 90% almost everywhere. So let me break it down. If we were to add the green bars, so the middle 40, with the blue bars, the bottom 50, let's take, for example, Latin America, we see that they sum up to 31%, which is lower than the 36% of the top 1%. So we see that in every region, or almost every region, the top one owns more wealth than the bottom 90% of the population. So it is not an anomaly. It is a systemic trait of our system, our economic system. Then, well, what are the mechanisms driving this inequality? Well, one of them is privatizations, and so private wealth has been growing at a very rapid pace, as shown in the left panel. And while public wealth has stagnated, East Asia is an exception, but public wealth in every region has stagnated, while the rate of private wealth has been increasing. And this is one of the mechanisms of why inequality is increasing. Another mechanism that I will talk more in a few slides is globalization, and how it's difficult to track wealth when it passes different jurisdictions. So then, in this graph, I also want to call back to Piketty's 2014 book, when he documented that the rate of growth of capital is higher than the rate of growth of incomes. And we also document this in this report. This graph shows that the capital share is growing more than the labor share. And we see that there are growing returns to capital, while there is a stagnation of returns to labor. We also see that capital shares are larger in the poorer regions than in the richest ones. Now I want to pass to gender inequality, which is another dimension of inequality. And this is something we added in the 22 edition of the World Inequality Report. And now we make a novel contribution in this report. First, to talk about how we usually measure gender inequality in how it has been done usually, is to analyze the female labor income shares. So of the total income of a region, for example, in this graph, how much of that income goes to women and how much to men. If there was perfect parity, each gender would get 50%. But we document that it is not the case. No, women persistently receive lower labor income shares than men everywhere. And in the best cases, women earn at most 40% of the total income, which is far from parity at 50%. So if income shares were split equally between men and women, each gender would get the 50%. There have been some improvements, so we can see that in North America and Oceania, Europe and Latin America, and also Russia and Central Asia has a relatively high levels, but we see other regions that lag behind. So, for instance, Middle East and North Africa and South and Southeast Asia. But then a novel contribution of this report is to not only account for economic labor. So what it has been typically been done in the literature, and yeah, it is to account. So far we have only studied the gender gap regarding economic labor. So this is the labor that we as society have chosen to give value to. It is the labor that is reflected in our national accounts, and it is accounted for in each country's GDP. But we as a society have not given value to domestic labor, to the hours we spend working at home or giving care activities. So a novel contribution of the World Inequality Report is to document how big the gender gap would be if we accounted for all the time men and women dedicate to labor in economic and domestic labor. In the left panel, we see that if we take into account domestic labor hours and economic labor hours for both genders, women work more hours. They work 53 hours a week versus 43 hours a week for men. This is an extra week every month. And in the right panel, we see that accounting for unpaid domestic labors, this gap increases. So let me explain it differently. So if we take the conventional gender gap, if we take the conventional definition, only accounting for economic labor, women, for every hour worked, women earn 61% of what men earn. But once we take into account this novel contribution, and we take into account the time spent working for both genders, we see that for every hour worked, women earn 32% of what men earn. So the gap, which was already huge, it's even larger. So this poses a question: why don't we value domestic labor? And then we see that, again, this is not an anomaly. No, we see that women work more hours in every region of the world, which is here depicted by the green bars. In every region of the world, women work more hours, and in every region of the world, the real gender gap would be much larger. Is much larger when we account where we account for domestic labor hours. It is much larger, the real gender gap, compared to the conventional gender gap. Regarding carbon inequality, so another dimension of inequality, it has to do with the climate damage and how we affect the habitability of our planet, no? And this was something that was already added in the 2022 version of the World Inequality Report, but we make another novel contribution. So it is important our contribution has to do with the fact that we use private ownership, so wealth. And I will explain a little bit more about that in a second. But first, let me say that the World Inequality Report shows that the richest 10% account for 77% of emissions associated with private capital. But the situation is even more extreme at the top. So the richest 1% account for 41% of all emissions based on capital ownership. In contrast, the poorest half of the planet contributes just 3%. In other words, those who have the greatest impact on the climate are also among those who suffer least from its consequences, because the richest have more resources to protect themselves, to adapt, or to move elsewhere. And those who are more vulnerable are those contributing the least. So those in the poorest half are those that are contributing the least, but also who suffer more the consequences. And an important innovation of the World Inequality Report is to present emissions not only by consumption, which is something that has been done before. So if we focus policy on households and on consumption, we are indirectly focusing policy on households. And policies such as carbon taxes or regulations based on the behavior of households, they could be regressive, or they can have little space for changing behaviors. So with this focusing on policy, more focus on firms instead of households, we want to redirect the attention to firms, to the investment decisions, and to the owners of capital. So who chooses where to make a new infrastructure project, where to make investments, and for example, who chooses whether to invest in fossil fuels or not, which can have a larger scale of impact, and where regulation or taxes can be more progressive. Then the margin for progressivity, changing behavior, emissions of reduction of emissions, and the climate damage can change more significantly. Well, in this graph, I just want to show that it's linked to the previous graph. The relative losses of the bottom 50 are way higher than those compared to the top 10. So the relative losses associated with climate damage of the bottom 50% is 74% compared to the 3% of the top 10%. And these and other findings can be found in the Climate Inequality Report, which was also published by the World Inequality Lab in, I think, November 2025, and you can explore in our website these and other results regarding climate inequality. Then I would like to talk about exorbitant privilege, which is chapter 5 from our World Inequality Report, and it's based on the paper by Gaston Nievas and Alicia Sodano. And in this paper, in the report, we document that the US exorbitant privilege has become a rich world privilege. So approximately 1% of the global GDP is persistently transferred through net income transfers from poorer countries to the richer countries. And this is because of financial and trade regulations that deem currencies such as the dollar or the euro as safe. And so these currencies, the demand for these currencies is high. It's a locked demand because of regulations, because of the construction of the institutional arrangement at the international scale. So because there's a persistent demand for example, dollar or euros or pounds or yens or Swiss francs, then this decreases the borrowing costs for the countries issuing these currencies. So the lower rates that these countries experience when borrowing, compared to the higher rates of the poorer countries, is a mechanism by which this differential is a mechanism by which there is a persistent transfer of resources from the poorer countries to the richer countries. And the important finding of this chapter and this paper is that these are not market dynamics. This is a result of the institutional arrangements. So regulations such as Basel III or legal requirements that compel central banks to hold reserve assets or countries to trade in safe currencies, they are fostering these results, even if rating agencies are also based in the richest economy and determine which currencies are safe or which debts are safe. So this is a mechanism that is embedded in the international financial and trade systems. And this is also a way in which increases inequality because it reduces the space for the poorer countries to invest in redistributive policies. For example, in this case, the BRICS would have much less GDP or income to invest in redistributive policies such as education, public infrastructure, health, research, and this persistent transfer of incomes limits their ability to invest in those. In this, we document several mechanisms in the report. One of those examples is the one that the share of global reserves by currency at the global level. And we see that most of the central banks have their reserves in US dollar or euros. And this is, again, as I said, something that is a consequence of the international financial rules, which lock persistent demands for these currencies. And we have a similar graph for trade and other dimensions. Now, let me talk about inequality in access to education, which is very important. I think I have talked about this a little bit, but I want to stress again that education is one of the main ways in reducing inequality. So redistributive policies in general, but I want to stress that education has a multiplicative effect. No, if a person benefited by education receives more and better education, they can have a better life outcomes. They can have more employability, better wages, more social cohesion, worse criminal, lower criminal outcomes. So it's like the person benefited by education policies can have a better life outcomes due to investments in education. But it's also multiplicative effect because children in higher educated families can also have a better context and develop further. So it's a multiplicative effect across generations, in an intergenerational positive effect. But then it is also at the macro level that can be possible. If more people are better educated, there's more productivity at the global scale, at the national scale, and more productivity can yield higher growth, less inequality, and more social cohesion. So it's very important. So this is why we stress that investments in education are key, in redistributive policies in general, but in education are key to reduce inequality. And we wanted to do a comparison of inequality of opportunities between regions. So before doing that, let me talk about the inequality between regions, only talking about income. So in this graph, we show the monthly incomes across regions. And we see that, inequalities are huge across, between regions. We see that North America and Oceania earn 3,800 euros per month compared to 300 euros per month in sub-Saharan Africa. So 300 euros per month is 10 euros per day, just to keep a scale. And this is only talking about the average person in each region. So if we were to look at the disparities within region, well, there's a lot of people who are earning much less than 300 euros per month. And then, so if we were to compare, we see that North America and Oceania incomes are almost 13 times larger than those in sub-Saharan Africa. And we see also from this graph that there's these different groups. So Europe and North America and Oceania become to a more high income group. Russia and Central Asia, East Asia, Middle East, and North Africa, and Latin America are more in a middle income group, with Latin America being below the world average. But Sub-Saharan Africa and South and Southeast Asia are below the world average and are part of this lower income group. Then if we were to compare this, so I said that North America and Oceania incomes are 30 times larger than Sub-Saharan Africa. But if we were to compare this to the public expenditure in education, we see that the inequalities of opportunities are even higher. So North America, the expenditure in education in North America and Oceania is 41 times larger than the expenditure education in Sub-Saharan Africa. And this gap, the gap between these two regions in public expenditure compared to the monthly, to the income per capita, is 3 times larger. So this just speaks to the huge differences there is. And as I said, education is key because it's a way of reducing inequality within and between countries. But without redistribution, it's difficult for society to reduce inequalities between and within countries. Then, I think another very important part of the report is talking about inequality and taxation. So the World Inequality, in the report, we document that the mechanisms driving inequality are, as I mentioned, large wave of privatization and increased private fortunes and globalization. But we also address, like, another key aspect is the lack of progressivity at the top of the distribution. So what do I mean? So an important way of reducing inequality is progressive taxation. And progressive taxation means that the more you earn or have, the more you should pay proportionately. So this is a mechanism in which inequality is reduced, but also contributes to more public revenues. And it's reduced mechanically, from having resources transferred from the top of the distribution to the bottom of the distribution, and this is mechanical, but it's also through more public revenues and public spending that can be translated into public investments such as education, public infrastructure, social protection, investment in research and development, that can also have positive outcomes in reducing inequality and fostering economic growth. So in a time of stressed public finances, maintaining progressive taxation is particularly important and a better alternative to expensive debt. But it is also important to maintain progressive taxation, not only to reduce inequality, but also because of social cohesion and fiscal justice. So, for example, if the population sees that some individuals can escape contributing to society through taxes, so if we are all paying our fair share, we are all contributing to society through taxes, but we see that those at the very top are not paying their share, then we feel less inclined to contribute, which can lead to a vicious cycle and affect public finances and social cohesion. So that's why also progressive taxation is important. Then going to this graph, in the World Inequality Report, we document that tax progressivity breaks down precisely at the top. So at the top of the distribution, the effective tax rates decline sharply for billionaires and centimillionaires, who end up paying proportionately less than the majority of the population. So it is important to stress that in these 5 countries, which they have the data and we were able to do this analysis, in these 5 countries, they are good at keeping progressive taxation all the way up to the 99%. So 99% of the population are paying proportionately what they should. So they pay their fair share and contribute to society. It is when we zoom in the top that we see that the wealthiest individuals are those who are not contributing. And well, one way, so this is one mechanism of why wealth inequalities is increasing so much at the top of the distribution. And how can it be addressed? Well, information and collaboration between countries, between jurisdictions has proved to be efficient. In this graph, we show that the share of untaxed offshore wealth decreased substantially after the start of the automatic exchange of bank information. So coordination is a way in which coordination between jurisdictions, between countries is a way in which the nocive effects of globalization from transferring wealth to another country that cannot be tracked, if countries share information, it's a way that these nocive effects can be reduced. But I wouldn't say it's the only way. I think countries can also act unilaterally. And we address this in the World Inequality Report. But let me say that another thing that we do in the report is present different tax justice proposals with baseline, moderate, and ambitious scenarios, and how minimum taxation can safeguard progressivity at the top. So in the report, we show that a 2% wealth tax on centimillionaires and billionaires would stop regressivity, but still wouldn't be regressive. So instead of being like this, it would become flat. There would be no regressivity, but still it wouldn't be regressive. A 3% wealth tax on these individuals would restore a slight progressivity. So we document that taxing fewer than 100,000 individuals globally, so affecting just the top 0.002%, with a wealth tax of 3% on these individuals that have a wealth higher than that are centimillionaires and billionaires. Well, this would represent a tax revenue that is almost 0.7% of the global GDP. So almost 1% of the global GDP could be obtained as potential revenue from taxing less than 100,000 individuals. And this would be 1.7 times the actual budget in education expenditure in sub-Saharan Africa and South and Southeast Asia. So by taxing less than 100,000 individuals with a small tax on a small rate of 3% would be enough to have almost the double of the actual expenditure in education in sub-Saharan Africa and South and Southeast Asia, that are 2 of the poorest regions and most unequal regions of the world, which are also very highly populated. So this would have transformative effects. And I only want to say this as a parenthesis, that these figures were computed using the Global Wealth Tax Simulator, which is a tool we developed at the World Inequality Lab, and you can find it in WIT.world, and you can also search it online as the Global Wealth Tax Simulator. And I invite you to explore it. No, you can simulate different scenarios at the country level, at the regional level, or at the world level, and play with the parameters. It's a good tool for policymakers. Then I think an important part of the report and a novel contribution is talking about the pro-redistribution coalitions and how inequality and the political sphere feedback each other and relate to each other. So we explore the relationship between political behavior and inequality. And in the report, well, we show that one of the most effective ways of reducing inequality is through redistributive policies, as I mentioned. So investment in education, health, science, innovation, public services, infrastructure. But then why don't we do it, no? Why don't we do these policies? And we show that a mechanism of why this happening is that stable coalitions for redistribution are difficult to form and sustain. So first, in chapter 8, you will find an image that says that the number of MPs or parliamentary representatives from working class backgrounds has decreased, well, is low and is decreasing. But then, so people that can aim policies for the working class is decreasing in the parliamentary bodies. But then there is also political fragmentation. And this is more speaking about this graph. We document in the report the emergence of a multi-elite party system in the working where the working class is not represented. So this limits the scope for the distribution. And what do I mean by this multi-elite party system? Well, if we look at this graph, we see that 60 years ago, the most educated and high-income voters voted similarly. They both tended to support more the right. But over time, there has been a fragmentation, a divide. Now, the top educated, who are not necessarily the highest earners, tend to support the left more, while the top earners continue to support the right. So this has made it difficult to maintain stable coalitions for this redistribution, since the left now tailors policies not only oriented to the working class, but also to this highly educated urban elite. Then we document that there is another dimension of political fragmentation, and it is a geographical dimension. We document in the report that nowadays the divides between the urban working class and the rural working class have reached very high levels, which are levels unseen in a century. So the working class in cities tends to vote left, while the working class in rural areas tend to vote right, as a consequence of unequal access to public services such as education, health, and transportation in the rural sphere. So this makes that stable coalitions for redistribution difficult to form and sustain, because there is divides in income, in education, and in the geographical sphere. And as a result, well, we see that without redistribution, there's more political inequality. This graph shows that the political influence of the top 10% is already very disproportionate. The report documents that the wealthiest donors concentrate much more of the political financing. So this limits the ability for democratic systems to pass redistributive policies to regulate capital or to adopt ambitious fiscal reforms. So economic inequality, this having more income or having more wealth, becomes a political inequality because they have a disproportionate influence over political decisions. Those with more resources can influence more the rules of the game. And with this, let me close by saying that the report presents the most up-to-date information on the evolution of income, wealth, and carbon inequalities. It is an open access tool for research and public debates, but also let me stress that it is not only oriented to researchers or policymakers. It is written in a way, structured in a way that it can be accessible to all the public. So we want to democratize this knowledge, that everybody could know what are the trends and what is happening regarding inequality, a very important problem for this century. And we need to keep in mind that inequality is shaped by the policies we implement. So we have a direct influence on inequality. We, through our our political participation, our democratic participation. So we have been able to reduce inequality in the past as a society, and a clear example is Western and Northern Europe in the decades between 1950 and 1980. In these periods, there were large reductions in inequality that were accompanied by strong productivity growth and economic and social prosperity. it was key to invest in redistributive policies such as education, research, health, infrastructure, workers' rights, public services, and progressive taxation. So if we want to address the challenges of the 21st century, such as climate change and erosion of democracy, it seems unlikely without more redistribution and inequality compression within and between countries. Thank you very much. So now I'm open for your questions.
Thank you very much, Ricardo, for this very extremely rich and very clear presentation. And here I want to highlight something that you just said, which is the ability of both the report and your presentation to present concepts and analysis that is in fact very complex in a very accessible and even intuitive way without oversimplifying them. Another key takeaway for me is something that you also just mentioned, which is that growing inequality is not inevitable. And you said that reducing inequality is a policy choice, but I would also add that growing inequality is in significant part also the result of policy choices, right? We always think of policy as the solution, but policy has also been part of the problem, and we can learn as much from bad decisions as from good decisions. So listen, we have only 15 minutes left for the questions, so I'll move straight to the questions and answers. And we have a couple of questions on the chat, but after I ask this, I would encourage participants to just raise their hands and they can ask the questions directly. If this is okay with you, Ricardo, I think this will make it more, instead of me reading questions and people typing. So here is a question from Lorenzo Uribe. What's your view on recent academic articles and newspaper articles questioning the extent to which economic inequality has really risen in past years and suggesting that the tax system in developed countries might be more progressive than previously thought? And I think Lorenzo is referring particularly to an article by The Economist that was published recently. Should I just give you two questions?
Yes.
Okay. The other one is, given the report's findings on extreme wealth concentration and its impacts on climate and human capital, which international policy mechanisms, such as a global wealth tax or coordinated redistributive transfers, are both politically feasible and most effective over the next decades to reduce global inequality? This is the difficult question. So let's start with these two. Yeah, let's start with these two, and then we can move on to a direct discussion.
Yeah, I think I know about this article of The Economist about the progressive taxation, and well, I think that rich economies have made big progress in implementing better progressive taxation, and as I showed you in the graph, and you can find in the report, they are very good at taxing almost all the way to the top, no? Almost all the way to the 99% of the population. It is just at the very, very top that the richest, the centimillionaires and billionaires are escaping taxation. And as I said also during the presentation, we do see that income inequality, there has been a compression in income inequality, but it is much more like the inequality is much more larger when we analyze wealth inequality, and it's extremely increasing at the top, which is obviously related to the fact that there is a lack of tax progressivity at the top, and there's resources can easily be transferred from one jurisdiction to another, and they are difficult to trace, no? So I think this connects to the second question, that a way in which we can reduce these inequalities, as I mentioned in one of the slides, is more cooperation between countries. So for instance, automatic exchange of information. I think this has turned out to be a positive outcome in which inequality, the share of untaxed wealth has decreased, and it has contributed to decreasing inequality. And yes, of course, I mean, if there were, as I said, education, quality education, and other redistributive policies are key. So yeah, I think maybe the UN or another organism can invest, like can invest in education in these regions that are lagging behind, so that we can compress the gaps in inequality. But of course, we need international cooperation, and we need cooperation across countries. No, I mean, there's also the possibility to implement unilateral actions, which can be feasible. So, for example, if a billionaire or a centimillionaire made their fortune in a certain country, and they want to move to another jurisdiction because they are charged less taxes, well, then that government where they made their fortune, they have the right to say, okay, if you leave, there is an exit tax. You should pay for a certain amount of years of the wealth that you made here, and this would increase the cost of changing jurisdictions. And it's a unilateral measure that it's feasible and countries can implement, even without cooperation and coordination. But again, I would like to stress that more cooperation, it's better.
Indeed, unilateral measures are much more limited in scope. They cannot achieve as much. I would encourage participants to raise their hand if they have questions. We have Wei Shun. Wei Shun, you just muted yourself.
Hi, thank you so much for the amazing presentation. I'm Wei Shun, also from DESA DISD. In our own research on inequality, we value a lot on the role of institutions. I was wondering on Piketty's assumption that the rate of capital return is always bigger than economic growth. Is he a little bit underplaying the role of institutions, which, the rate of capital, excessive return of capital is not root cause for the wealth inequality, but rather an outcome like diminishing collective bargaining and the disproportionate political influence of the uber rich over our political institutions, therefore making it even harder, like you point out in your presentation, to form a political coalition to do more redistributive policies. So we'd love to hear more insights on that from you. Thank you.
Well, yes, I would like. Sorry, yes.
No, I just wanted to see if there were, if we can take a couple of questions, if this is okay. There are no questions. Yep. Can I ask mine?
Yes.
I'm curious about the urban working class, because what you have shown on the screen at least is that the rural working, if we can call it working class, still the rural working class votes more for the right than the urban left, that the urban working class or the urban low-income groups. But that doesn't mean that's proportional. That doesn't mean that the urban working class is voting as much for the left as they did 20 or 30 years ago. So I would like to know what's happened there, because I'm assuming that with the declines in unionization and the political platform that unions provided and the fragmentation of low-income workers themselves, there may have also been less support for left-wing parties. But yeah, I'll let you answer that. I don't think we have more hands, so go ahead with the answers.
Yeah, so on the first question, going back to Piketty's so the rate of capital being larger than the rate of growth of income. I would say that there's several research by us, by the World Inequality Lab, but also by other bodies of research that have documented that. And well, I will also invite you to check the World Inequality database website, the WIT.world, and where we have several papers regarding that. There's actually one paper by Luis Bauluz and others that is it's now still in the working paper dimension. And let me just make a small commercial now. So the World Inequality Lab, now there's a lot of efforts focused in the Global Justice Project. This is a project, a report that will be published in June of this year, and when there will be the World Inequality Conference. And you can visit the Global Justice Project website now. And there's so far, I think, 6 or 5 papers that are making this Global Justice Project. And one of these papers is the one by Luis Bauluz, where they document more about the fact of the rate of capital growing faster than the growth of the economy. So I think this is a very important project, and I invite you to review that. Regarding the second question, I think, even though I do not have the answer, and I think, again, if I redirect you to the literature, I think the recent book by Thomas Piketty and Julia Cagé talks about this, about the different, the fragmentation between the rural right and urban left in the working class. While I don't have the exact answer, my intuition is that it has to do also with the fact that even within cities, there is some fragmentation of services. Like there's some marginalized regions within cities. So in some regions of the cities, some citizens would tend to vote to one side and then others to another. But I have to admit, I do not have the answer.
Okay, thank you, Ricardo. I think we have time for one more question, maybe two. So if anyone wants to ask, Maren?
Thank you, Marta, and thank you, Ricardo, so much for your presentation. As Marta said, you know, the World Inequality Lab work is really a reference for our work on the World Social Report. I had two questions. One is well-formed. I'm still thinking about the second one. The first one is, you know, there was a lot of conversation about the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on inequality. And at the time, it's always been hard to answer just because we didn't have enough data, real-time data on what was happening. So my question to you is, are we far enough out of the pandemic now to make at least some kind of judgment in terms of how the pandemic affected inequality trends? And my second question is on your slides on political fragmentation in terms of the decoupling of education and income and party alliance. And I'm wondering, you know, to what extent not only labor unions themselves, but the labor market has a role to play in trying to close these gaps, only in that you have highly educated workers that are relatively lower income. And that's why you have these two different classes. So is there a role then for the labor market and to expanding opportunities for highly educated workers to close that income gap in terms of, or match it in terms of their education and income, and as a way to address some of the political inequality that we see today? Thank you so much.
Sorry, I did not understand your second question.
No, I guess, yeah, my second question is, I'm sorry, not as fully formed, but, you know, to what role that in addressing political inequality is not only about redistribution and what we traditionally think about redistribution, but also in terms of labor market, closing labor market gaps, and then trying to kind of close this decoupling between education and income.
Okay, I see. So I think I will start by this one. So I guess now there's a bigger supply of educated people, and well, the labor market has not grown to supply as many positions. So I guess it has to do with the unemployment of these higher educated people. Maybe having positions in lower incomes according to their education levels, to their skill levels. And this could also, well, speak to why they are voting, they are fragmenting, no? And I did not mention this, but there's this paper by Kusiemko and others that they talk about how the left, particularly in the USA, this is a context they study, the left is now partitioned, no? It's now partitioned in having so there's the pre-distribution policies and the redistribution policies, no? The redistribution policies are more of what I have talked here about having more progressive taxation and using cash transfers and investment in education and health. But there is this other current of policies that can help reduce inequality and can also help with labor rights and with worker rights. And I mentioned upon them briefly, but it's exactly, no, like union rights, like strengthening union rights and increasing, for example, minimum wage, which we have seen happening in different regions of the world. So I guess this is another way in which inequality can be reduced. So through these pre-distribution policies, not only the redistribution part, but then if the political alignment for the redistributive policies is difficult to have, then it's harder to have for the pre-distributive policies. And then regarding your first question on COVID-19, yeah, okay, when we sat down more than a year ago and discussed about what would we include in the report, we touched upon that subject, upon including a specific analysis in the regarding the COVID-19. At the end, we didn't do it, but we did perform some analysis, and yes, we saw that the rate at which wealth inequality has grown, not only in the last 30 years, which is what I showed you, but also in the last 6 years. Well, it has been the inequality has increased much more since the COVID-19 pandemic. That is for sure. Yes.
Okay, it's 11:01, 5 p.m., more than 5 p.m. in Paris, Ricardo. So thanks so much for the great and very rich presentation and for the report. And we are going to follow up on all the references you gave us and the conference that you mentioned in June. It's taking place in June, right?
In June in Paris, the 4th and 6th of June, you can search for it as the World Inequality Conference. Yes, and the Global Justice Project is also a big project that is happening now.
Great. Thanks so much, Ricardo. Thank you, everyone, and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye.